Hey YouTube, Tweak here, bringing you all an update to my Skull Servant Yu-Gi-Oh deck profile for post-Blazing Vortex. With the release of the latest Yu-Gi-Oh booster set, we were given one of my favorite new cards, basically just on art style, but with an awesome monster effect as well, and that is White Baking for the Skull Servant deck. This powerhouse definitely does provide for graveyard support and also just more search power for these Skull Servant cards altogether, just adding to the King of the Skull Servant play, which is your main go-to play in the Skull Servant deck overall. So I wanted to do an update for the latest booster set, because it definitely is support that we've been waiting for that makes this a powerhouse of a deck. I also wanted to focus on pure zombie power for the Skull Servant deck, so I won't be relying on any of the Lightsworn Mill setup, just focusing on some of my own techs for the spell and trap card lineup in the deck as a whole. So let's go ahead and get started with the deck profile. So for the Skull Servant monsters, I run 3 Skull Servants. This is just a normal monster, but it's that much easier to set up with plenty of other spell support we run in the deck, like Unexpected Die, and just being able to use this card for some pretty easy extra deck summons can easily set it up in the graveyard if we do open up this card in our hand. But other than that, it's easy search power with cards like White Baking, which then can easily be discarded to the graveyard after searching out that and another Skull Servant card. But you want to run 3 of it just so you have more and more power and banish options for cards like King of the Skull Servants, which, speaking of King of the Skull Servants, we also run 3 of this card. This is the original attack of this card, becomes the number of King of the Skull Servant and Skull Servant cards in your graveyard times 1,000. When this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard as a result of battle, you can banish one other King of the Skull Servant or Skull Servant card from your graveyard to special summon this card. So an easy special summon back onto the field. Just for the reduction of a little power boost, you can summon it back out and then have hopefully even more power up next turn depending on what cards you send to the graveyard. But if you want to protect this card from being destroyed on your field, there is the new option, which I'm sad I only was able to pull 1 of this card because I love this artwork, and you definitely do want to run 3 of this card in the deck, and that is White Baking. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard, like all of the Skull Servant family. If a level 3 or lower zombie monster would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can discard this card instead. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 2 monsters with different names from your deck to your hand, except for White Baking, that are either Skull Servant or specifically list Skull Servant in its text, then discard 1 card. You can only use this effect of White Baking once per turn. So the protection effect not only will set up another Skull Servant monster in your graveyard to power up your King of the Skull Servant on the field, but it will also provide you a search power to get one specific card, whether it be, let's say, King of the Skull Servants, and then just a Skull Servant in your hand for then you to discard the Skull Servant, setting it up in your graveyard for more of a power boost when you do summon out this card, and then just protecting whether you had one of the other family members of the Skull Servant family on the field, because it said level 3 or lower zombie type monsters, which apply to all the different Skull Servant monsters we run in the deck. So definitely want 3 of this card. Like I said, I can't wait to get more. Sadly, I just couldn't pull more than 1 with all the booster packs I opened this weekend, and definitely will be wanting to collect more of this just for the collection overall. I also run 3 White Mare, one of the older cards for the deck. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard. You can discard this card, then activate one of the following effects. You can target one of your banished Skull Servant or White Mare, return it to the graveyard. So not only will that set up power in your graveyard for your King of the Skull Servants, but the second monster effect lets you target one of your banished Lady in White or King of the Skull Servants and special summon it onto the field, with Lady in White protecting your monsters in the field from being destroyed by battle, and King of the Skull Servants being your boss monster you want to summon out. So 3 White Mare just provides you a setup, whether it be for graveyard setup or for your field setup. You have plenty of options by discarding this card. And not only that, but it'll set up your monsters in the graveyard using White Mare itself for that play altogether. I also run 3 White Prince. This is more graveyard setup. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can send 1 Skull Servant and 1 Lady in White from your hand and or deck to the graveyard. And you can banish 2 Skull Servants and this card from your graveyard to special summon 1 King of the Skull Servants from your deck. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard. So it's worth the investment, honestly. You're going to be, summoning out your main go-to monster, and we have plenty of other monsters, which we discussed already, that you'll be sending to the graveyard for this card alone. So 3 monsters, which can even be summoned or set up back in the graveyard thanks to other Skull Servants we run in the deck, makes it well worth it for sure to run 3 of this card for that setup. And another easier way to summon out White Prince from the deck to the graveyard is with White Princess. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while it is in the graveyard. If this card is normal or special summon, you can send 1 White Prince from your deck to the graveyard. And during either player's turn, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard to have all monsters currently on the field lose attack and defense equal to their original level or rank times 300 until the end of this turn. So not only will that power boost make way for a big attack boosted King of the Skull Servants, but this card sets up White Prince, and then will send more monsters. So with just this, you have a 1 card setup in your graveyard to summon out King of the Skull Servants onto the field to use for that setup, and then being able to have a 1600 attack by monster clear the way of any other monsters in the field to then attack your opponent directly with the King of the Skull Servants you summoned out. And then for the last of the Skull Servant family monsters, I run 3 Lady in White. I even considered dropping this card down to 2, but decided to keep it at 3 just so we have a full monster power-up of all the different monsters we run in the deck. Face-up level 3 or lower zombie monsters on the field, except Lady in White, cannot be destroyed by battle, and are unaffected by spell or trap effects, and this card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard. So you can set this card up in the graveyard quite easily with your White Prince, but also just being able to summon it back onto the field with White Mare if it's banished, and then having the option of White Baking, being able to protect your Skull Servant monsters while on the field, makes it all the better for sure. So 3 of this card, even if you open up this card, being able to set it in defense and you have your opponent attack into it, they're running into a 2200 defense monster. Depending on if they summoned out a boss monster or just something with high enough attack to go into this, they could potentially just leave this on the field for you, then summon out your other Skull Servant monsters and have them be protected by battle. And then for some of the other generic zombie support, I run 3 Mizuki. You can banish this card from your graveyard to target 1 zombie monster in your graveyard and special summon that target. So obviously your target's going to be King of the Skull Servant, but with one of my special techs I'm running in the deck for mill power, it definitely does make it for easier setup. We also have our next zombie monster lineup to help with the graveyard setup of this card, and that card is Gozuki. With this card, during your main phase, you can send 1 zombie monster from your deck to the graveyard. If it's sent to the graveyard, you can banish 1 zombie monster from your graveyard, except Gozuki, to special summon 1 zombie monster from your hand. So whether it be graveyard setup to special summon a zombie King of the Skull Servants from your graveyard onto the field, or hand power, Gozuki comes in handy, but I only run the 2 for that setup depending on its situational. You have the recycle power with Mizuki to summon a Skull Servant from your graveyard back onto the field, but you need to either have Gozuki on the field or sent to the graveyard for this dependent play, and obviously having the Skull Servant King in your hand to summon out, which is more situational, where you'll find it'll be in the graveyard more than your actual hand. That's why we're only running 2 of the Gozuki. But for more zombie setup in the graveyard, along with some synchro options, I run 3 Unizombie. Not only does this card help with the level adjustment on our field, but it can send a zombie monster from our deck to the graveyard, increase the target's level by 1. So even if it's just a level 1 boost, we have plenty of synchro options for the variety in our deck to go into. I mostly like it for sending the zombie monster from the deck to the graveyard for that setup, for power boosting our King of the Skull Servants even more on the field. And then that sent power can be even better depending on what zombie monster we sent, like White Prince. And that is it for the monsters. It's definitely a high monster count, but they all work very, very well together. And just for all the different setup, you could potentially have King of the Skull Servants at an attack boost that is immense compared to a lot of other decks in the game for sure. For the spell lineup, I run 2 Unexpected Die. This is just an easy special summon of our go-to main monster in the deck, which is Skull Servant. We run 3 of this card, so just having this card be a special summon instead of the normal summon for the deck means we can summon out this card with this card on the field, and then summon out King of the Skull Servants with our normal summon, or potentially one other card in the deck that we run, like let's say Mizuki, being able to then set it up in the graveyard that much faster by going into a Link summon. The rest of these spells in the lineup are all 1-ofs, but they're all very, very useful 1-ofs at that. I run 1 Where Art Thou. This is great for search power. I even considered dropping this card for a 3rd copy of Unexpected Die, but that's player preference, or you can mix around the numbers of Unexpected Die and put in a 2nd copy of Where Art Thou. You don't really take much in life point burn, so just being able to search out another level 1 monster by controlling one is very easily met in this deck for sure. 1 Foolish Burial, graveyard setup. That's really all there is to it with this card, while Monster Reborn can special summon King of the Skull Servants without having to rely on a banish. I also run 1 Call by the Grave. You do send plenty of cards with this deck to the graveyard, so if your opponent Ash Blossoms, it could take away from the potential of a lot of setup for sure. I also run 1 Burial from a different dimension. With all the banishing we do, you want some more graveyard setup. Being able to target through banish and return them to the graveyard can potentially be, with this quick play spell, a power boost to your King of the Skull Servants on the turn that it attacks into your opponent. They may not expect it to be the game-winning attack, and then you activate this card, and then it is. And then lastly, the best 1-for-1, setting up monsters in the graveyard, along with special summoning out your go-to boss monster. All the better for sure, but each one of these play a vital role in the deck, so you definitely do want to run each one with them having that purpose for sure. And that's it for the spells. My go-to trap tech, I definitely do like running Needlebug Nest in the deck. This is here for the setup of our graveyard even more, just with the potential of 5 cards. Yes, it is a trap card, so you do have to wait a turn, but 5 cards in the graveyard can just be the play you needed or the power boost needed to a King of the Skull Servant you have on the field, depending on what you might send to the graveyard with this card. Most of the time I do prefer having White Baking in my hand to use, but even if it's just in the graveyard, if it's sent to the graveyard, you can add 2 monsters, being search power alone with that. Needlebug Nest just sets up more zombie monsters, whether it be Mizuki, Gozuki, you name it, all the different options in the graveyard with this card. If I open up multiples in my hand at once and activate both, it's even better because this card is not a once per turn. You have plenty of options to rely on with this card altogether and your Skull Servant plays. And that is it for the main deck. We'll now move on to the extra deck. I run 1 Vampire Sucker. I don't really need it at all for the tribute effect. It just needs 2 zombie monsters to make this link. And if a zombie monster is special summoned from the graveyard, you can draw 1 card, which will definitely happen a lot with this deck. So having that draw power is a big plus for sure with this card. 1 Wee Witch's Apprentice with the Skull Servants, and the majority being dark, makes it all the better for a power boost onto the field. I run 1 Underclock Taker, the attack lowering of your opponent's monster. If you just have that difference between your opponent's attack points and your King of the Skull Servants, being able to lower it in an attack with King of the Skull Servants can mean the game-winning play against your opponent for sure. I also run 1 Nightmare Cerberus and 1 Nightmare Phoenix. Destruction, whether it be with spell or monsters, both of these cards definitely do come in handy. For the level 1 plays, I run 1 Link Karibo. Spoke of this card already before, but it can be great setup with Skull Servant, just summoning it out and then setting it up in the graveyard and giving us a better monster on the field to use. If you have multiple Skull Servants in your hand, Link Spider comes in handy just for more special summoning on the graveyard, being able to summon out a Skull Servant with the 1 Link Spider, summoning another onto the field, and then using them both for the Link summon. And then lastly, for the Link monsters, 1 Nightmare Unicorn and 1 Borolo Dragon. Power plays with both, and if you set up a lot of monsters in the field and want them in the graveyard that much quicker, Nightmare Unicorn and the other Nightmares especially, for their discard power off of their monster effects, just sets up more in your graveyard for you to use. And then for the Xyz monsters, I run 1 Slacker Magician, 1 Sylvan Princess Sprite, and 1 Kinki Nagashi Fucho. With the protection off of Fucho, the search off of Princess Sprite, and the negation off of Slacker Magician, all these level 1 options will not only set up monsters in your graveyard, but help you with more protection plays against your opponent. And then for these synchros, I'm just running a variety of level 6, 7, and 8. So 1 Stardust Charge Warrior, 1 Black Rose Dragon, and 1 Stardust Dragon for the variety that you can go into depending on what you want to summon out against your opponent. I have all these options, and the level adjustment with Unizombie makes it all the better for sure. And as for some of the go-to plays in the deck, whether you want to rely on the mill that Needlebug Nest sets up, you can either send a potential White Prince to the graveyard, sending out more cards, the Banish Recycle Power, the generic Skull Servant, or even the White Baking you can potentially send off of this card as well. All giving you search power. You might hit some of your spells with each of the Needlebug Nests, but all these zombie monsters give you a potential to set up in the graveyard a card that you can use to then banish or set up even more on the field later on afterwards. But also remember, with White Baking being your newest card to go into, if your opponent were to attack into your King of the Skull Servants and you send this card from your hand to the graveyard, not only will you protect it from being destroyed by battle, but also giving it the potential boost in power, because not only will that, you will search a King of the Skull Servant and also 1 additional monster, and then discarding that other card will not only set up White Baking in the graveyard, but the one you discarded, boosting this card out by 2,000 more attack altogether. And then there's some other plays to rely on. Once again, going off of the special summon off of White Prince, summoning out your Lady in White will give you more special summon search, but White Princess and the White Prince search will just set up more and more cards in your graveyard for you to use, whether it just be these 3 cards with that normal summon. You then have the special summon options for your 1-for-1 to get King of the Skull Servants out on the field, which we spoke of before, making it that much easier, and then the more protection if you just have the multiple White Bakings in your hand all together. But that is it for the deck profile. I hope you all enjoy the video. It's definitely a deck I'm going to be continue to play, test, and just see how much I like the playstyle of the pure build now. I might try some other ones for sure, but I definitely do prefer the pure zombie build for Skull Servants altogether. And until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and Kira Twig out.